Okay, why don't we get started? So I'm Elliot Cohen, Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of in our Dean Speaker series, the last of this academic year, and indeed my last as Dean. And I'm really glad that our final guest is Congressman Andy Kim. Congressman Kim represents the 3rd District of New Jersey. He had a distinguished career in public service in the State Department, USAID, Pentagon, a tour in Afghanistan in that capacity, working for General Petraeus. He also has spent a stint on the National Security Council staff as the Iraq director. And in addition to all that, he's really very SAIS. He's got a DPhil from Oxford in international relations and quite a distinguished academic career. So we're going to do this a little bit differently than we have in the past. I'll ask Congressman Kim to speak for a few minutes, lay out some ideas about foreign policy in the post-COVID world. And then what we'll do is I'll, as I usually do, have a conversation with the speaker. And after that, I'll open it up for Q&A. If you want to get a question into the Q&A box, I would urge you to begin doing that now. It frequently crowds up. We have a hard stop at 3:45, and I'll be ending it then. So use the Q&A function, not the chat function, which won't work, if you want to put in a question. So, Congressman, if you would be willing to turn on your video, thank you, and unmute yourself. And let me just extend you a warm welcome to SAIS. I wish we were doing it in person, but that's for a little while yet still the world that we're in. And with that, I'm just going to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Dean Cohen. It's really an honor to be able to share a virtual stage with you, and I do have to have the time and opportunity to be able to in person at SAIS down the road, as it's an institution I have an immense amount of respect for. And I want to just congratulate all the students, those who have graduated, those that are continuing on with the incredible learning and research that you're doing. I really look forward to continuing to engage with you all and drawing upon your expertise as I go forward, as you go forward, as we collectively try to do what we can to understand and react to the world that we live in. I want to just, I don't want to go into anything too formal here, as I love to have just sort of a dialogue and get to the questions as well. But I wanted to just kind of talk through this concept that's laid out before us about what it means to be shaping the post-COVID-19 world, what it means to be entering this stage. First and foremost, I want to start by seeing where we've come from. I mean, within my own life and the life that many of the students have gone through. I mean, I grew up in an era really towards the end of the Cold War. I was too young to fully understand what exactly was happening. I remember watching the fall of the wall with my parents on TV and seeing them glued to the TV, seeing things that they never thought that they would necessarily see. But for me, I didn't understand it. I didn't fully understand what was happening at that moment. I think the first time I truly understood a paradigm shift moment of global politics was when September 11th happened. That was something that happened while I was in college, and something that really just fundamentally changed my outlook on the world around us. And when we saw what came next, you look at the Cold War era with the fall of the Berlin Wall being this moment of bipolar powers in the world, about this great power competition. And then you see with September 11th, the emergence of, in some ways, a struggle between the nation state and non-state actors, whether that be terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or about, you see the other non-state actors that were affecting and shaping that space. Even when you look at the financial crisis and how financial institutions were able to literally rock the foundation of nation states and their well-beings. It was something that was different than what we had seen before. And this era that was driven so much by September 11th and its aftermath, is something that we're now seeing challenged once again. And this is something that we've been seeing hints at this over the last couple of years. We've seen a greater understanding of the rise of China and its impact upon the world. And so a lot of people were already saying that there is a new era of global politics emerging. But then COVID happened. And with COVID, what we saw was a situation that so clearly altered the global landscape, in ways that we still don't understand. I've worked in national security my whole career, but I've never seen anything quite like this. I've never seen a situation, something that I've been calling an everywhere crisis. I've never seen something where we have seen a crisis hit everywhere simultaneously and have this kind of situation where we cannot even triage necessarily because there's nowhere to triage from. It was such a different experience than anything I had encountered before, especially when it comes to war and conflict, which is predominantly what I've worked on. So this new era, this COVID-19 is bringing about this new era, this new paradigm shift moment. But what we know is that the contours of this are still very uncertain. We do not know exactly what's going to happen. But what we know is that this is something that will certainly take more shape in the months and years to come. Now, as I said, many of us, we've seen multiple paradigm shift moments within our own lifetimes. And there are lessons, obviously, to learn from that and something that I'm still trying to draw upon. So I'll start by saying I don't have all the answers. I don't know exactly what is going to happen next. And anyone that says that they do know what happens next with certainty is just, I believe, wrong. There's just so much fluidity to this system right now. But I do think that there are some ways that we can look to try to approach it, to try to understand what might we encounter coming forward. One question that I think about a lot is the question of what is actually in our control or influence? What are the things in this new era that we can expect to be able to control, with United States power? With that, of course, we have to approach this with a lot of humility, that the tectonic plates are literally shifting beneath our feet. There is a tremendous amount of fluidity to these paradigm shift moments in global history. We are a powerful nation, no doubt. We are the most powerful nation in the world. But one thing that I learned when I was at the White House is you cannot conflate power with control. So while we do have a tremendous amount of power and the ability to exert that power in every corner of this globe, it doesn't necessarily mean we can control it. It reminds me of an instance I remember at the Situation Room when President Obama was being briefed by Chairman Marty Dempsey about a military operation, and Chairman Dempsey was talking about the operation and saying what we hope to be the outcome, but he said, but there's no guarantees that this would happen. And President Obama, I remember, kind of leaned forward in a way and kind of tapped his finger on the table in the Situation Room in the JFK room there, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, the one thing I never ask for in this room is a guarantee. And I remember that. I thought that was a very profound statement. I didn't realize it at that moment. I just kind of wrote it in the margins of my notebook. But it's one that really tries to get at this idea that while we are powerful, we can never understand absolutely what happens next. But when we look at what are the things we might be able to control in this new paradigm moment, this new era, that I think that we get at some of the things we're talking about now in DC about investments at home, about infrastructure, about developing the right workforce, something that I think is so critical when it comes to what happens next. And also our own ability to shape technology and other advancements for our own means and for our production and progress going forward. So that's one element of it. There's another critically important question to really try to assess, which is what are the main external forces affecting our decision space? So who is it and what is it that is trying to constrain us externally that, again, not necessarily in our control? I think the first one that so many people talk about is China. I think there's a growing consensus that China will certainly be a defining, if not the definitive element of this next era in terms of what happens next with the United States. I often say that as well. I share a lot of that. There is a lot of talk about renewed great power competition, not necessarily Cold War type great power competition. And that is something that we need to be very mindful about. Sometimes I think the rhetoric that we use is too much drawn from the last time we experienced great power competition. And we have to recognize that both the competitor is different, the moment in time is different, and the space around us is enormously different. So that is one aspect of this, and this question of whether or not China will actually attain the power that they want. I know that they certainly see this era right now as a moment of passage where they will pass us and usurp our top of the global power order. You know, that is something that they see for destined, and we certainly have different opinions there. So that is one aspect of it. But when I look at the broader level here, in some ways, both the United States and China in this new era so far, we also see places where we are constrained. Both of us are constrained. And that gets at something that I was actually speaking to some of the students about just before this, which is about the rise of transnationalism. Now, the fact that this new era of global politics is in some ways pushed through with something like the pandemic, which is truly a transnational threat, truly a transnational moment, it does bring to bear what transnationalism will actually do to shape this next era. Things that are not fully in our control. Obviously, the pandemic. Climate change is another example of a transnational threat that will undoubtedly manifest more and more over the course of this new era. Innovations that we have globally, you know, things that we see manifesting in multiple places, multiple times, not directly under the control of nation states or others, including and then other trends that we see, whether that's rising authoritarianism or the challenges of being able to assert what the truth is anymore. You know, these are broader problems that we're experiencing, not just in the United States, but all around the world. I've been a fervent believer that transnational problems do require transnational solutions. Now, there then rises the question, how does one actually develop a transnational solution, especially in a foreign policy space that is still predominantly dictated by nation states or international institutions that are collectives of multilateral efforts derived from nation state agreements. In addition to these problems that we have and these transnational threats, there is another layer on top of that, which is about technology, and technology is affecting all of these different elements. We're seeing a change in the world through these digital and technological advancements, whether it's the Internet of Things or 5G, that will just explode this at a level that is far beyond anything we comprehend right now. You know, we have about, I think, estimated about 27 billion devices hooked up globally right now. We're going to see that expand many times more. And the way I sort of describe it, especially in the context of warfare, for instance, is that cyberspace is not simply another dimension of warfare. It actually plays by a completely different physics. So in cyberspace, Russia is as close to the United States as Canada is. It collapses our understanding of time and space, and therefore actually is a fundamentally different kind of understanding and requires a different kind of warfighter, a different kind of diplomacy, a different kind of effort to be able to harness what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So I say that as things that we're trying to contain. And the last thing I'll just say is that as we think about how to shape this next era, yes, we think about what we control. Yes, we think about what external factors are trying to determine and shape our decision-making space. But then there's also this question of what is it that we actually want? What is our actual vision for this era? So much of this era right now that I hear about is shaped by what we think could go wrong, about a concern for a new Cold War, or about concern of climate disaster, or about concern of the rise of authoritarianism all over this world. But what is the positive vision? What is it that we seek to shape? What is it that we're trying to get to? What is it that we want America and the world to look like, not just at the end of this year or next year, but 20, 30 years from now when my kids are my age? So that's something that I don't know all the answers to. But I want us to aspire to try to explain that and understand that, especially because that is ultimately how we can talk to the American people about this. When I talk to my constituents here in New Jersey, I cannot simply tell them what we need to do when it comes to international politics solely based off of what we are most fearful of happening. But we do need to present the American people with that vision of what American leadership can accomplish in a positive direction over the course of this next era. And I think that's upon us to try to identify that, to try to shape it and hone it, and to be able to clearly and articulately and simply explain that to the American people for us to try to be unified in our collective approach to shaping this. So with that, Dean, I'll turn it back to you, and I look forward to a conversation here.
Well, thank you for those. There's a lot to work with there. And again, just want to remind everybody, if you want to put in a question, use the Q&A function. Listening to you, I was thinking, you were talking about how 9/11 is the shaping event of your childhood, which kind of shook your world. I will be revealing more than I probably should about my age when I say that mine was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which again, I saw through the eyes of a child, but you could sense the fear on the part of the adults that this could be something colossal and catastrophic. And I think we sometimes forget about the Cold War, just how serious that all seemed. I'd like to begin by engaging you a bit on what I think was the central theme, which you handled in quite a subtle way, of the relationship between nation-state kinds of issues and transnational kinds of issues, and of course pointing to COVID. And if I could, I'd like to push a little bit on that in the interest of a good conversation. Can't you make a case that in some ways what's striking about COVID is actually the power of the nation state to kind of seize or react to a transnational threat of this kind, use it for its own ends? And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Obviously it became a subject of or kind of a tool of conflict between the United States and China, the Wuhan virus, and so on. More importantly, I think it's fair to say the Chinese used their what was their undeniable success after some huge missteps initially at containing the virus by some pretty draconian measures, and say, look, compare that with the United States. On the other hand, I think it's also fair to say, look at the United States, or on much, much, much smaller scales, say Israel or the UAE, and say, wow, there are some states that were able to pull it together. You see that even in Europe, where the Brits, there was clearly, I think, an effect on how people thought about Brexit, because, well, it turned out the British on their own, with whatever stumbles they had, were able to do a better job of getting their populations vaccinated and getting things under control. So it seems to me, and with the United States, in our typical clumsy way, we kind of screw around with lots of things, and then eventually we mass produce miraculous vaccines. And I could go on and on about vaccine diplomacy and so on. So isn't part of the story of coronavirus also the way in which nation states can use and will use these transnational threats for some pretty traditional ends?
There's no doubt about that. I mean, the transnationalism is something that does add some enormous complexity, but it doesn't always determine what things will look like at the end. So nation states do have a capacity to be able to shape within that, and we're going to see some longer lasting effects of that. Not just in terms of which country came out ahead or not, but we're going to see some major changes, for instance, when it comes to supply chains, when it comes to trade and economic means. There's definitely going to be some big movements here that we haven't quite fully articulated, and certainly a lot of other aspects of that. But you're right, this is certainly something that in some ways creates that kind of fluidity, and nation states can try to utilize that for their advantage, and those that can best manage and navigate that can succeed the best. And we've seen that even with other transnational threats when it comes to transnational terrorism and others, and certain countries have been able to navigate that better than others. When we look at what is to come when it comes to climate, those are potentially even more severe and long-lasting challenges than what we're experiencing when it comes to a pandemic. There is no vaccine to climate change.
Yeah.
And as a result, it requires a much more sustained and structural response, even beyond anything that we've seen when it comes to this pandemic. We're very lucky that this virus so far looks to be able to be contained by a vaccine. I know there were some questions about that initially, and we would be in a very different state right now if there was not such a definitive and effective solution to it at this point. But I agree with your point wholeheartedly, though.
I guess one question is, which should we be losing more sleep over? It's clearly a seriously worsening relationship with China. And I'm struck that there's bipartisan consensus on that at a time when there's very little bipartisan consensus in this country. And, there's objective behavior like the takeover of Hong Kong, which is very concerning. Or these transnational issues, or is it basically your view is, well, you just have to wrestle with both as best you can?
Yeah, well, look, I prefer to not lose sleep over either, because again, like as I was kind of saying, like let's focus in on what we can control.
Yeah.
And in both of those circumstances, the actual solution is actually very similar in some ways. If we are able to mobilize the fullness of United States innovation and technology, if we can strengthen our workforce, if we can mobilize, our education system to train up the skilled labor that we need for the 21st century, we will actually put ourselves in the best possible situation to address both of those challenges, both our competition with China, as well as to innovate and execute our efforts that we need to address the worst of climate change, at least from our part of it. And again, the problem with transnationalism in particular is that we don't control all the cards there. Even if we did everything 100% right in America, it doesn't mean that we can actually solve this problem because there are so many other actors involved. But that kind of effort of just trying to focus in on what we can control and trying to identify that as much as possible, I really think that's something that we need to be focused on. And we tend to think about things too much outside the context of that kind of goal. And I hope that we can think about it much more so.
Interesting. Let me ask just one more question, then I will go to the Q&A. You talked about how becoming a father sort of reshaped some of your interests, and it's clear that you're obviously deeply engaged on domestic issues. Since nobody runs for Congress, to think primarily about foreign policy, there are far less painful ways of doing it. Does that, and clearly the country has all kinds of very substantial domestic challenges. Does that imply to you to some extent that, because decision makers' time and energy and focus is limited, that the United States needs to kind of retrench a bit, not withdraw from the world? I don't think anybody's proposing that, not talking about becoming isolationist, but really maybe engage a little bit less or in a much more focused way when we do engage, so that you can focus on domestic things. I mean, arguably, you can say, listen, this is what the Biden administration is trying to do in the Middle East, although the Middle East may have other ideas, to be able to just say, look, we're not going to do a whole lot over there because we have to focus on domestic things. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think that would be the right way to approach it in terms of I don't think we need a moment to kind of step back from the world and regather ourselves and then re-engage. I don't think that that's the right approach. I think America, we gain our strength from momentum. And to use it, and since you talked about me as a father, I'll use an analogy that I'm doing recently. One is that I'm trying to teach my 5-year-old how to ride a bike right now. And I try to explain to him the concept that speed and momentum add stability. If he stops pedaling, he will lose his balance. He will not be able to actually ride a bike. What we need as a country is to get back into gear. We need to find that gear that allows us to recognize how proud we are of American ingenuity, of American progress, that is ultimately what's going to unify us, if anything can. I struggle right now to understand what can unify us, especially after January 6th. And what I've come to determine is that the answer to our question, what's going to unify, is not going to come from politics. It's going to come from our ability to find our gear again about what it feels like to be in a country that is revving, that is moving forward, that is the dominant and innovator in the entire world. We need to find that feeling again. So I want us to find our balance and find our strength through that momentum, and be able to come out stronger because of that. So I don't want us to take a step back. In fact, this is a moment for us to engage in further, especially because, as I said, I really do believe that this is a paradigm shift moment in global politics. And there is a tremendous amount of fluidity at the beginning of these types of moments. And that doesn't last forever. It starts to harden and solidify as the era moves further along. So others are trying to shape this moment. Others are trying to take advantage of this fluidity right now, and so should we. So it's important that we try to do everything we can to try to structure this in a way that is most advantageous for what it is that we want to accomplish.
Great. Okay, we have a whole bunch of questions out there. I'm going to pick and choose. So again, I'd urge people to put your questions in there. Jay Kimmel asks a question that also occurred to me, I must say, while you were speaking. How have your views on the roles of the executive and Congress in foreign policy changed since your election to the House?
Yeah, well, I spent, the bulk of my career in the executive branch. And as I mentioned before this talk, I was a career person. I wasn't a political appointee. And that very much shapes a lot of my understanding. I bring that kind of thinking to the legislature, which is inherently a more political entity. But I'm trying to do my best to see if I can exist in that structure, while still trying to maintain that mentality of a career public servant. The other aspect of it that I find interesting is that being on the legislature side very much reinforces concerns that I had on the executive branch side, which is that we are not telling a strong story to the American people about why foreign policy matters, why national security matters. And I think we're losing because of it. I felt this when I worked at the White House in 2014, 2015 with doing the work of the counter ISIS fight. We did not make a strong enough argument and paint a vivid enough picture to the American people why it was that we were doing that. And I still think it was the right thing to do, but it was not something that was made clear. And you cannot just get that message out there through press conferences and briefings from the West Wing. I think there needs to be a much more concerted effort to have State Department officials and others go out and hold town halls and to engage with other folks. I feel it in my district. When I came back from Afghanistan 2019 from a CODEL, I had a town hall, 5 days notice for a town hall. We had like 300-400 people show up at a moment's notice. People are hungry for this. That idea that American voters don't care about foreign policy, it's wrong. We just don't engage it in the right way. So I feel more and more convinced that we have to make sure that we push out there more, recognize that foreign policy starts at home, and make that case, especially when we have so much at stake coming forward. I can see how our competition with China is manifesting in all sorts of different notions amongst the American people. Some of them can be potentially dangerous if we continue to let that grow.
Yeah. I just want to say how much I agree with that. I think one of the things that happened is in the early Cold War, presidents understood they had to persuade the American people of the need to engage abroad, because deploying 1/3 troops to Europe in peacetime, completely unthinkable at any other era in our history. But after a while, the consensus was so strong that I think we just got out of the habit of making the case to the American people, and that's across administrations. And my own experience in the Bush administration, where I guess we overlapped in the State Department, was quite similar. I had a similar feeling about that. I'm going to take a question by Irene Gonzalez and reshape it a little bit. She's asking basically about the problem of polarization and how you get past it. Now, I don't know if everybody in the audience realizes you're the first Korean American Democrat elected to Congress, I believe. You represent a 85% white district that went for Trump twice. So there's surely a story there. And I'd be curious to know your version of the story, because it sounds remarkably impressive to me. But it must mean that you deal with that question of polarization in a very immediate way as you engage with your constituents. So could you just run with that in any direction you like?
Yeah, no, look, you're right. I'm one of only 7 Democrats left in the country that represents the district Trump won. I'm the only person of color in the Democratic Party that represents a district Trump won. And but this is my home. This is where I grew up. I did my whole kindergarten through 12 in this district. It's where I'm raising my kids now. So, I had no choice. This is my district, and I'm proud of it. But you're right. It does give me an opportunity to connect with people and engage in that kind of dialogue. I mean, the fact that I outperformed Biden by 8 points in this district, I think shows that we're onto something here about how we connect with each other. And it's gotten me to think about this concept that I've been kind of calling strategic vocabulary, trying to understand how people utilize words, what words they use, what engagements they have. For instance, I did a town hall, and there was a gentleman there that told me that he doesn't believe that mankind is responsible for climate change, and and a number of other issues. And I said, look, I'm not going to engage on that side of things. But one thing I do have to say is that you live in this area, right by the shore. One thing I'm sure you've seen over the years is just a tremendous amount of change when it comes to flooding. When it comes to flooding in this area, when you talk about what we need to do next about making our communities more resilient from the issues of flooding, when we need to make sure that we're taking this to the next level and engaging in other steps, like, for instance, we want America to be the global leader of the energy of the future. And it's interesting because I can have a very different conversation with him if I draw from words that I'm hearing from him or others in the community, rather than using words that one would identify from news or social media. Like if I told him climate change, if I used that phrase, I very much think he would have kind of gone back to his partisan corner. And it's kind of like a landmine that just sets you off. And there are certain words that kind of trigger that within people. So I found a really interesting ability to just kind of listen to people, hear how they talk about different issues, and then find ways to be able to communicate back to them, utilizing a lot of the language and the phrases that they use, and try to avoid some of the ones they probably hear on, attack ads on TV or, in the news and things like that. And I find that, we can have a very different conversation in that kind of way, much more productive conversation in that kind of way. So that's certainly something I've been intrigued by and I'm still working through.
Are any of your colleagues on the Democratic side trying to learn lessons? Because it seems to me that that's really something that's necessary, and that I often don't see a whole lot of, namely people just trying to figure out where people with very, very different views are coming from. And it's on both sides. I certainly have seen plenty of it going in the other direction. So I'm just curious, do your colleagues think of that as an oddity, or how do they
Yeah, I
think?
mean, like, what you're essentially asking me, Dean, is just like, like, how much do we take as our responsibility to listen rather than just talk all the time? And I don't know. I mean, look, I try to explain, how I engage. I've now done 36 town halls in my district in 2 years, and I find that kind of engagement to be remarkable. A huge part of politics is just showing up. Listening to people and caring that way. So I don't know. I struggle because I never want to tell someone else how to do their job. I very much recognize that each district is different. But I do think right now, at least, especially in these districts like mine that are have very people with very different opinions, I do think it's so important to try to take the temperature down, find opportunities to engage. And a lot of these skill sets that I learned are ones I learned at the State Department about how to bring people together, find areas of common ground to build off of, to be mindful about your vocabulary. So I never necessarily thought I used these skills, here at home, but I do find that it helps, try to create a space for conversation.
Yeah. Actually, let me this may end up being the last question, which I regret. Sean Wissing asks a question about, it's basically about science and science skepticism. I mean, because if you think about it, so much of what we're talking about, with whether it's with climate change or with, say, vaccines. I mean, we've had some pretty well-educated neighbors tell us things about, nanoparticles and vaccines, and I mean, just all kinds of stuff which we're agog at. And I think it is fair to say that this being able to wrestle with some of the essential qualities of truth. We're not talking about getting everybody a degree in biochemistry. We're talking about something much, much more basic. Seems to have become more difficult. And you see it manifested in various ways. You do see it on the climate change and vaccine front. But I think, you can say, if you look at the spread of QAnon, I mean, stuff that's really certifiable, you have to wonder how people process truth. And that's kind of a metaphysical question, but it's also a practical political question. Could you speak to that at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I worry about this a lot. I agree that I feel like we're losing a capacity to understand shared truths. And we're losing, frankly, just a capacity of sharedness in our country. And that's something I worry about immensely, just losing touch with what it means to just be an American or what it means to be a citizen. But the way I sort of look at it is that, yes, it's an erosion of truth that we've been going through, but where does that stem from? In some ways, it actually stems from an erosion of what it means to be an authority, and what it means to have respect. Like for me, I'm not a medical doctor, much to the disappointment of my father and my mother. So when I'm getting information from somebody about the vaccine or something else, how do I know that they are telling the truth? It requires me to see that person as an authority figure, to be someone that can be trusted. So that is the breakdown that we have. Truth is all around us. Truth is here. The problem that we have is not information. I always say that, I didn't coin this. I think better minds did. But, this idea that like information is not the scarce resource in our country or in our world right now. It's attention, and the capacity for us to be able to capture people's attention and be able to connect that to figures of authority. But for us, when we lose that trust and we lose that understanding of who's an authority in something, and we think, and I don't know if that's something where it's because we have brought down the standard of who is an authority, or we have just lost it altogether. But that's where I feel like we are. So it's an unmooring. We're unmoored from an understanding of authority. And that then prevents us from understanding where truth actually is. The truth is there, but it's just we don't know, who to kind of anchor it to. So that's why so much of the work that I try to do is trying to re-engage what it means to be an institution and our institutions of government. As someone who worked in government before, I know how important it is to have those institutions strong. I've also seen in recent years how fragile they can be, and that's difficult. But I'll just end with this. The words I had from a boss at the State Department, he told me that you don't have good government unless you have good people working in government. And that's why I'm spending so much time trying to re-engage on issues like civics education and national service and things like that, because I think that that's what it takes for us to reestablish what it means to be an authority, and therefore try to re-anchor our understanding of truth.
Well, it's an issue for educational institutions, including this one, which try to send a lot of good people and do send a lot of good people into government. I'm going to wrap this up by asking you for a brief comment on one thing. I think members of the audience may not know Congressman Kim from anything other than a viral photograph taken the day after the insurrection. And that was of, you went to, I guess, the rotunda, and there was the place was trashed, and you just spent a couple hours cleaning it up. You want to say something about that?
Yeah. It's still hard to think about. I still feel like I'm processing that day. I started I started cleaning up the rotunda. It was the night, it was the night of the insurrection, probably around 11 p.m. We just finished our first vote in the House chamber on the Electoral College count, and I walked into the rotunda for the first time since the end of the riot, and just saw this room that I think is, in my opinion, the most beautiful room in the country. I just saw it, really desecrated. I mean, cigarette butts put out on the statues, and the wooden benches and others, smashed. So I just felt like I need to do something. I didn't really think about it, about what to do. I just saw a roll of trash bags and just started to try to clean. I think for me, I since then, thought a lot about the first time I ever was in that room, which was with my mother, an immigrant to this country, who was so proud that she could be able to walk me into the Capitol, show me around. So I think I just kind of did what I thought she would do. That we just try to make sure that we have a sense of humility about what comes next and our role in it.
Yeah. Well, that's something to think about on Memorial Day, isn't it? And I will just conclude by saying, there's that phrase, servant leadership, and that's what occurred to me when I saw it. So thank you so much. You're a busy guy, and thank you for taking the time. This was a fascinating conversation. Everybody in the audience, thank you as well. I hope you've enjoyed these conversations nearly as much as I have. And with that, farewell, and everybody have a good holiday weekend. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Dean. Take care.